日本の機械要件非常に優しい。これ犯罪歴がなければ誰でも許可される。居住年数の5年というのは短すぎるのではないか。
Recently, I have been seeing a lot of people saying something that actually annoys me a little bit. So this is people online, people on TV here in Japan, politicians, random people in other countries commenting on this. And that is that it's too easy to naturalize in Japan, to become a Japanese citizen. But is it? Let's talk about it. Now, it's quite difficult to argue with the statement that it's too easy to naturalize in Japan because, whether it's easy or not, whether it's too easy, that's going to depend on your own viewpoint. But a lot of people are saying that it's easier to naturalize than it is to get permanent residency. Getting permanent residency, becoming a permanent resident, is a really good idea if you live in Japan. There are all sorts of upsides to getting permanent residency. The biggest one for me is that you no longer have to apply for a visa. So if you have a work visa, if you have a spouse visa, a dependent visa, if you have a long-term visa even, you need to apply to renew your visa every so often, whether it's every year, every 3 years, every 5 years. You have to go in and you have to apply again and wait to be given permission to continue to live in Japan, to have your visa renewed. Now, permanent residency, you don't need to do that. Once you get permanent residency, there's no expiry date on your status of residence. You can basically stay here forever under certain conditions. So permanent residency can be revoked. If you commit a serious crime in Japan, your permanent residency can be taken away. And now there are new laws coming in that say that if you willfully don't pay tax or if you willfully don't pay into social programs, your permanent residency can also be revoked. But as long as you don't do that, you can basically live here for as long as you want to. And that is huge because obviously applying for a new visa is a hassle. And recently immigration is getting more and more busy. It's taking longer and longer to process visa renewals. And not having to deal with that at all is a huge quality of life upgrade. Another good thing about permanent residency is that there's no restrictions on what kind of work you do. And in fact, you can choose not to do any work at all, which is very nice. So if you want to do a side gig, if you want to start trying out some new line of work, you can. There's no restriction on employment for permanent residents. It's much easier to get a loan if you have permanent residency. So if you want to get a mortgage, it is possible to get a mortgage without permanent residency, but you're likely to find fewer banks that are willing to give you a mortgage, and you might end up paying a higher interest rate. So having permanent residency is a big advantage if you're looking to buy a home and borrow money from the bank to do so. And the final big advantage is that permanent residency is unconditional. So there's no requirement that you have to fulfill in order to keep your permanent residence. Unlike a work visa where you have to be in employment, or a spouse visa where you need to have a spouse. And there are some very unfortunate situations where people have, got divorced, for example, or maybe their spouse has died. And at that point, your spouse visa is no longer valid. You would need to get another visa. And getting another visa is going to be up to the discretion of the immigration office. So if you're planning to stay here for good, if you're planning to retire in Japan, stay here for the rest of your life, it is probably a good idea to think about getting permanent residency. Now, there are some disadvantages to permanent residency. It's not all advantages. There are basically some tax things that kick in once you get PR. So the big one is that if you have permanent residence and you leave Japan, you would be subject to Japan's exit tax. So if that's likely to be a problem for you, you definitely want to get some specialized advice before applying for permanent residence. If you're coming from a work visa and you get permanent residence, you would then become eligible to pay tax on overseas inheritances and overseas gifts. And for some people, this is going to be a deal breaker. So again, if you're likely to get a large inheritance overseas, you probably want to stay on a work visa until that happens. Because unless you'd been in Japan for more than 10 years, as long as you're on a work visa, you wouldn't have to pay Japanese taxes on that overseas inheritance. But if you're on a spouse visa, or PR, you would have to pay Japanese taxes on that. We have a couple of videos about inheritance tax in Japan and some articles on the site as well. So do check those out if you're interested. But for most people, as long as you're not worried about these taxes, getting permanent residence is a bit of a no-brainer here in Japan. It's a huge quality of life upgrade, and there's very few downsides to it. Naturalizing, on the other hand, is a bit more nuanced, I think. So there's no real practical reason to naturalize if you already have permanent residence. So what does naturalizing get you compared to PR? Well, the first thing is that you have the right to live in Japan rather than permission. So with PR, as we saw during the pandemic, some permanent residents were not allowed to return to Japan. If they'd left Japan after a certain date, they weren't allowed to return until the kind of pandemic restrictions were lifted. Citizens were not restricted during that time. So that's a huge one in some ways. If, like me, your life is here and you're planning to remain here for the rest of your life, then citizenship might be something to consider as well. As a citizen, you can vote, you can run for public office, and you can do certain jobs that are restricted to citizens, mainly in the public service area. But it's not hugely compelling. So compared to PR, citizenship doesn't really get you anything unless your current passport isn't very strong. So the Japanese passport is one of the strongest in the world, gives you visa-free travel to most countries. And so if you're coming from, maybe the US or maybe from Europe, that's not going to make so much of a difference. But if you're coming from a country with a weaker passport, that could make a huge difference in terms of the kind of travel you're allowed to do and being able to move internationally more freely without having to apply for visas and so on. The huge downside for naturalizing in Japan is that you have to give up any other nationalities that you might have. And for most people, this is the deal breaker. They're not willing to do that, so naturalizing in Japan is not something that they want to do. Let's look at the mechanics of getting PR and getting citizenship in Japan. So to get PR, you would apply to the immigration office. But to naturalize, you would go through the Hōmukyoku, the Ministry of Justice. Completely different organization, completely different level of scrutiny as well. Looking at the numbers, so the number of people who naturalize in Japan every year is just over 10,000. This has been pretty consistent over the last few years, and it seems to be a structural limit. The number of rejections is about 500 people a year. So that's the number of people who applied to naturalize and their application was ultimately turned down. Now for PR, the number of people getting permanent residence in Japan every year seems to be around 35,000. So over 3 times as many people getting permanent residence as compared to getting citizenship. And the actual requirements are far more rigorous for naturalizing. So to get PR, a lot of people talk about the length of time you have to live in Japan. So the basic length of time you have to live in Japan to apply for PR is 10 years. And to naturalize, it's 5 years. So on the face of it, that seems like naturalizing might be easier. But in fact, in order to apply for PR, if you're on a high-skilled professional visa, if you have the right attributes, you can apply for permanent residence within a year of coming to Japan. And if you're married to a Japanese citizen, once you've been married for 3 years, you can apply for permanent residence here as well. So in many cases, the amount of time you have to live here in order to get permanent residence is much less than it would be to even naturalize. On top of that, to get permanent residence, you have to not have broken the law, you have to be up to date with your taxes and your pension payments and so on for the last couple of years. You need a guarantor, you need someone to sign off on you, either a Japanese citizen or a permanent resident who's willing to vouch for you. And you becoming a permanent resident has to be judged to be for the benefit of Japan. So it's beneficial to Japan to have you as a permanent resident. And that's about it. Recently, as immigration offices are much busier, and there doesn't seem to have been an increase in the number of immigration officers or a streamlining of procedures, getting permanent residence is taking longer and longer and longer. So it used to take between 8 months and a year, more or less. And recently it's taking much longer. It's taking a year and a half. It's taking 2 years. So the application process is really dragging out for a lot of people. Obviously, that's going to be different depending on which office you apply through. But generally speaking, it's taking longer and longer because we have more and more people getting visas here in Japan. For naturalization, the process is over a year, generally speaking. So it used to be longer to naturalize than to get PR. And now with the immigration office backlog, that's flipping more or less. Now, in order to naturalize, as well as being willing to give up your existing nationality, you do have to go through a whole bunch of different things in order to get that. So the big one is that you need to get documentation that proves all your family relationships. Basically, when you naturalize, when you become a citizen, Japan needs to make a koseki tohon for you. That's kind of family register. And in order to do that, they need to have documentary evidence of all your family relationships. And for many people, this is the hardest thing about naturalizing, because this kind of paperwork might not exist in your home country. And so if you can't somehow get this stuff documented, it's difficult to proceed with your application. As well as that, you need to have a flawless record for basically the whole time you were here in Japan, which is actually kind of weird in that the longer you've lived in Japan, the harder it is in some ways to naturalize, because you've had much longer to rack up problems, to rack up traffic offenses, to rack up late payments for things, and so on. So you're basically expected to have been more or less perfect the entire time you were in Japan. And the longer that time is, the harder it is to naturalize. You need to provide all of your financial information. So you have to provide your current bank statements. You have to provide a written budget that describes how you spend your money every month. And so do all your family members. So anyone that you live with, whether it's a spouse or any other family members, they all have to provide the same level of information, and they're held to that same standard. So if your spouse has some kind of issue, that could result in your application to become a citizen being rejected. There is a language requirement. So for permanent residence, there is no language requirement. For naturalizing, you're expected to have the Japanese language ability of an elementary school third grader, so a 9 or 10-year-old. And this sounds pretty easy. This sounds fairly reasonable, right? Okay, so a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old, that's fine. But this is the complete language ability of a 10-year-old, including reading and writing. And that is going to catch out a lot of people, including me. So my Japanese is reasonable. I got the JLPT 1 back in 2009. I've given lectures in Japanese for an hour or two. I've done workshops in Japanese. I read in Japanese. I'm fine emailing people in Japanese and writing in Japanese and so on. But at no point in my life have I needed to handwrite Japanese. So that's a really big skill gap on my part. So I can read Japanese and I can type Japanese, but I can't handwrite it. And if I applied to naturalize here in Japan, there is a chance that I'll be asked to demonstrate the handwriting ability of a 9 or 10-year-old. And right now, I don't really have that. So that's something I'd have to work on before applying. Now, you might say, well, naturalizing doesn't sound so difficult if only 500 people are rejected per year. That's only about 5% of the number of people who are accepted. But the thing about naturalizing is that when you want to naturalize, you have to go through an introductory interview, and then you have to go through a formal interview, at which point you would apply. Many people are weeded out in the introductory interview and they're told not to apply, basically. So it's kind of, if you're allowed to apply, it means you're quite likely to get it. Whereas with permanent residence, anyone can submit an application at any point. And so the rejections are higher because there's no real control of who's applying here. So is it easier to naturalize than to get permanent residence in Japan? I think no. I think it's much harder to naturalize. The requirements are higher. The consequences of naturalizing, having to give up your own citizenship, is much more severe. It's a much more difficult and drawn out process. There's a wider range of things that they look at, and they're very strict. So becoming a PR, there's that condition that says it has to be in the benefit of Japan for you to become a permanent resident, it's much higher to naturalize. So they're looking at, do they want you to be a citizen? They're actually going to come round to your home. Sometimes they'll even come in your home and have a look around inside just to see what kind of life you have. And so the bar is that much higher for naturalizing. One reason I've been looking into this is that I've been thinking about naturalizing in Japan for a very long time. I actually had that initial interview in 2011, about a week before the earthquake. I had the initial interview at the Hōmukyoku here in Sendai. It didn't go very well. They really caught me up on the handwriting bit. I got a lot of pushback from the person that interviewed me. And then, of course, after that, we had the earthquake, and I kind of put it on hold for a while. After seeing some of the discourse this year, especially for the upper house election, it really got me thinking about naturalizing again. And so I have booked an interview for that initial naturalization interview. It's going to be at the end of October, and I will be documenting it here on the channel. So if you're interested about naturalizing in Japan, about finding out what that process is like, do subscribe and watch out for future videos. I'm going to do a series about this, probably one video for each step of the process, how it works out for me. Hopefully I'll get through that initial interview this time, and it won't just be one video where I'm like, yeah, I failed the interview, guys, sorry. But what do you think? Is naturalizing in Japan something that you might ever consider? Is it something you'd be interested in? Let us know in the comments. Let me know if you've got any questions. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.